Good day to you. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Detroit City, Michigan, with my wife and my daughter, who's 24 years old, and we were there to see the Rolling Stones, the Stones in concert. Here's a little footage of what we saw. This is my man, Keith Richards. Most people know this guy better. Yeah, most people know Mick Jagger better. It's really hard, as an understatement, it's really hard to believe that these guys are still playing at the ages of 78 years old like that, especially given the lifestyle they've had, which is, to put it euphemistically, a rock and roll lifestyle. It's even harder to believe, really, that music is existing like this today, where I can go to a concert and with the same device that I use to call and text people, I can record some video and it's perfectly legal. And I can then put it on some cloud up there in the sky on YouTube, and all of a sudden that piece of that video is available for whoever wants to see it. That's amazing. And that's not always the way that music was. Music, think about it, for Christmas had to be sung in person. All those songs that you might have heard during Christmas, whether you're religious or not, whether you celebrate Christmas or not, going around and hearing Christmas music, those songs were sung before they were recorded. They were sung in the middle of a desert. They were sung outside of somebody's house by carolers. Those songs had to be sung live. And so something has happened to music to make it really, really different today, to make it recordable and to give rise to bands like the Rolling Stones, who can play for 60 years. They're coming up on their 60th year anniversary, as well as lots of other artists and many people knowing about these artists. In other words, making music mass produce. So that's a long intro today, but we're talking about audio today. We're talking about audio, and the chapter takes on audio in the class. This is our 6th chapter. And today the tools that are available, not just in terms of capturing video on your phone, but the suite of editing software and apps that are available on Apple phones and Android phones and laptops and notebooks. The tools that are available today make it more than ever possible for artists to distribute their music. In fact, many people in this class probably have your own YouTube channels. Probably there's a music theme to those channels. You probably use music in some way, shape, or form. If you have YouTube, maybe it's your own music. It's just so easy today to record music. You can record music just by yourself. You can record all your vocals, you can record all your rhythm, you can record all the instruments if you want to. And some people are talented enough to do that, and you just upload it to YouTube or Facebook or wherever you want to put it. But at the same time, it's really, really difficult to break out as a successful music artist, because so many people can do exactly that. They can put their stuff in a cloud. And also radio. Radio is very, very tied to the music business, right? That's how a lot of people hear music for the first. That's how you hear your first Taylor Swift song that just came out, for example. That's how you hear your first Bruno Mars, your first Drake song. Radio, well, maybe not Drake so much, because that's like word of mouth through social media. But radio happens to be very formula driven. It's very difficult to make it into radio unless you are one of those famous people that I just mentioned. So what I'm saying is, even though it's really easy to produce music today, not so easy to become successful at least commercially. Now, let's go back and talk about the history of sound recording. Where did it come on to the scene? Because, like I said, in the old days of Christmas music, before there was sound recording, if you want to hear somebody play music, you had to be where the piano was. And let me tell you, piano's not going too many places. So music was not that portable. I mean, of course, you can sing. You can bring your voice wherever you go. But a lot of other instruments, they take a while to set up. So music was performed live. And performers used musical scores. They performed from sheet music, which was produced because of the printing press, right? The printing press made sheet music standardized. It could be printed, and so musicians could start to copy and learn how to play music without being necessarily needing to be taught by another person. But this whole scenario changes because of another inventor we're going to start highlighting now, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, the most famous inventor, probably he's known as the most famous inventor. He invented in 1877 the phonograph. The phonograph was a cylinder. It's like this shape. And again, I have links that you can follow along today, and you can see what a Thomas Edison phonograph looked like. It was a cylinder with a needle that dropped down on the top of it. And his very first song that he used on this foil cylinder was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary Had a Little Lamb was the first time a song was recorded. First time a song was recorded on a foil cylinder. Thomas Edison, by the way, did not invent this phonograph originally for music. He invented it for dictation so that you could talk and have it recorded. And the phonograph made it possible for the very first time to store music. How amazing is that? You could store a song and take it somewhere. How profound is that? Don't have to be in a live room where it could vary each time the performer sings it. Along comes another inventor that improves upon the phonograph. His name was Emil Berliner, Berliner, from Germany. Edison from the United States. And Berliner invented the gramophone. The gramophone took Edison's idea, but instead of a cylinder, he used flat discs, right? You can kind of see the forerunner of vinyl and even CDs with the flat discs there. His were made of zinc. They were made of zinc. And they allowed for the mass production of discs. Much easier to produce discs than cylinders. So the music is stored in the discs, and then the discs are mass produced and sent out. So now you have music being spread around. That's Emil Berliner in 1888. But eventually all of these devices that had the spinning discs took on Edison's name, even though they were technically gramophones. They all became known as phonographs. So when you hear phonograph today, it does refer to the flat disc that's spinning around. A couple other inventions that improved sound recording. In 1935, high fidelity was developed, or hi-fi. Hi-fi, just like we have Wi-Fi today. That term is not that new. Wi-Fi, coming from wireless fidelity, is also coming from high fidelity, hi-fi. And basically this technology allowed music to be recorded with using more sophisticated mixing mixing. And so you have, in essence, richer bass tones and higher treble tones. Basses and trebles start to come out. If you listen to music, even early music in the 1950s before we had stereo, music all sounds in the middle. It's jumbled in the middle. It's like the mid-range, if you know what I'm talking about tone-wise in music. Hi-fi allows those basses. You know, when you hear people going around with a thumping bass today in their cars, just the woofers, that's all they have, it sounds like. That's because of hi-fi technology. And then another technology we want to highlight is in 1949, magnetic tapes started to be used. Magnetic tapes. 1949, instead of having to etch the music mechanically into vinyl, or zinc for that matter, tape could be used. And that tape was used in reel-to-reel tapes. If you've ever seen those, it was used later in cassette tapes, these little cassettes that you pop in. It was used in VHS tapes that people used for television later on. Tape allowed for better editing. You still had to mechanically cut the pieces of tape. You want to cut out that drum solo as you're producing this band, you cut the tape. That still had to be done. That's how music was produced in the 1960s. But it allowed for that editing possibility that was not there before with putting a song into an etched vinyl disc or zinc disc. Now let's talk about the transmitting of music. So we got one thing is storing music, recording music, and then distributing music, but another one now is transmitting music, and we're basically talking about the birth of radio. And here's a profound statement for you to consider as we enter this part of the instructor video. Before radio, actually before the telegraph, which is the first form of electronic communication, before the telegraph and radio and television for that matter, communication had to be transported. That is, you had to pick it up and move it. Write a letter, move it. Newspaper, put it on a train. Magazine, carry it and bundle it and stick it in a shop on the shelves. All of those, you're carrying the communication. For the first time with the telegraph, which we'll explain in a moment, and radio and TV, now music, voice, sports can be instantaneous. And the person who's sending the music, the sports, the voice, from a studio in LA can be located very far away from the person 2 hours away in Huntington Beach, California, in their car as they're driving to work listening to radio. Profound development. No more transportation. Completely wipes out a sense of time that's needed to communicate, in essence, to at least mass communicate. So the telegraph broke through that. Basically, that invention was in 1844. Samuel Morse, Samuel Morse, or the Morse code, Morse code that comes from him. He was in the army. He developed a way of communicating using dots and dashes, and a telegraph. A telegraph is like a stapler. It's like you have a stapler, like that one end, and you have a cable that runs to another stapler-looking device. It's not really a stapler, but it looks like that. And at the other end, through magnets, you can see in the link today, it bounces up and down and makes a noise. It's either a dot or a dash noise. That's what the Morse code is, dots or dashes. So he invented this way of communicating using dots and dashes. It was used mostly in the war. And they built this telegraph cable underneath the Atlantic Ocean. That's how important that was as a national security property underneath the ocean floor so that we could communicate with our bases in Europe. So that was all. 1866 was the completion of that. But the telephone wires were very susceptible to enemy attack. You take a submarine down there, you can cut them in half, and now the United States can't communicate. So it was just a moment of technology in the war where I want to mention now the development of technology that also happens to be mass communication technology. In 1888, now we're going to start to get into radio. In 1888, Heinrich Hertz was a German. Heinrich Hertz, Hertz, just like the car rental company. And actually, if you know anything about, or if you know much about electronics, you've heard that word Hertz, like gigahertz and megahertz. That's where his name is coming from. Heinrich Hertz. He developed radio, get this, as a theory, like on a chalkboard. Like it's possible to send words and music using this device called a transmitter to this device called a receiver through the airwaves. Nobody will see it, through the magic of the air. And the music is going to come out of a box. That's Heinrich Hertz. Amazing, right? Like he thought about this. And people today, I imagine when I talk about this, that people today are thinking to themselves, can we time travel? Let's theorize about that. And then maybe in 80 years we'll be time traveling. I don't know. But Heinrich Hertz developed radio as a theory before it was a practice. It took Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian. That's his name, Guglielmo Marconi, 1894. Guglielmo Marconi, he created what was known as the wireless telegraph. Wireless telegraph, that's point-to-point radio communication using the airwaves instead of a cable. In the old days, Heinrich Hertz's method, you had to have a cable, right? Running from San Francisco to LA to tell you when the train is coming in. But Marconi developed a transmitter. Still not sending voice, still only sending dots and dashes. And one of his first transmissions that's well known to break a barrier was from England to northern Canada and to Newfoundland, if you know where that is, Newfoundland, Canada, all the way from England. That was Guglielmo Marconi, tremendous achievement. That was a long distance to be covered by a single act of communication. Again, no transportation needed. All right, then we turn the century here. In 1901, we get a physicist in 1901 who actually figured out how to send voice over the airways. His name was Reginald Fessenden. He was a physicist, and he figured out how to send voice over the air. And so I don't know if you figured that's out from the three people I've mentioned, but they were all scientists who were driving the radio. And they were not mass media producers, mass media moguls. They weren't investors. These were scientists that were driving the radio industry. Now let's talk about a person who has fame in a couple different areas. His name is David Sarnoff. Sarnoff. He was originally on the Carpathia ship. I don't know if that rings a bell. That's the ship that came to the rescue of the Titanic, although too late to save most people. And he was on there, and he was in charge of radioing back to New York information to help first responders get ready for people who were coming back who were rescued from the Titanic. In part because of that experience, he went into the radio industry, and he was working for the Marconi Company, big company, the Marconi Company. And he came up with what is known as the famous radio music box memo. Famous radio music box memo, where he perceived of radio as being more than a point-to-point communication medium, from one sailor on a boat to one ensign at the dock in New York. That's point to point. That's how radio is used. Instead, it should be a mass thing where one source sends out a radio signal and many people can listen to it at the same time. And they would do that through this radio music box. It was a box that would be in people's houses. That's what he said. It was amazing. And that's what sold the idea of radio. But what really made it amazing was his marketing strategy, because he called it a household utility. He wanted radio to be a household utility. See how he's describing it there? A utility is something you need. It's useful and you need it. Electric is a utility. Water is a utility. Natural gas is a utility. Cable is a utility. And according to David Sarnoff, so was radio. Now let's talk about a company that became a monopoly and then had some problems. It's called the RCA monopoly. Maybe some of you have RCA television sets in your house right now. Did you know that stands for Radio Corporation of America? Radio Corporation of America was making most of the radio technologies in the United States, but when World War II came along, the Navy took control of the radio patent process because they didn't want the patents to fall into enemy hands. Remember, radio and telecommunication, really any kind of communication in a time of war, is critical that it's protected. And so the patents were seized, and RCA was then created. Sorry, I got this a little bit backwards. During World War II, the Navy took control of radio patents, and then RCA was created so that the government wouldn't control radio exclusively. It was formed out of several companies to give a fairness to it as a balance to the government seizing patents. So RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, was formed out of these strange companies: General Electric. Yeah, you know that one. Big refrigerator company, and then later on electric company, and then also finance company, and AT&T, which you may or may not know stands for the American Telephone and Telegraph Companies. Started as a telegraph company before it was into telephones. Telephone and Telegraph. Westinghouse. Westinghouse used to make refrigerated train cars, among other things. And this is the weird one, the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company. Why? Because one of the first uses of radio was going to be just outside of the banana plantations in Central and South America, places like Panama, where the boats would be approaching and they'd need to communicate with people on the plantations, or they want to communicate to get those bananas onto the boats. So that's what RCA was. Now, when do we get the very first radio station? Well, we actually get it right here in Pennsylvania. I mentioned that last class. KDKA is the letters. Now, if those letters seem strange to you, that's because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has ruled that any radio stations that are to the west of the Mississippi River have to start with K, and any to the east of the Mississippi River have to start with W. But KDKA and KYW in Philadelphia happen to be two stations that got grandfathered. They were formed before the FCC made this ruling. That's why every other radio station to the east of the Mississippi begins with a W. At any rate, we get KDKA in Pittsburgh, and they used transmitter to send out election returns. That's the very first radio broadcasting. Other highlights to radio: WEAF was a New York radio station, WEAF, and it was the first to sell advertising time. First to sell advertising time to AT&T, actually. So the American Telegraph and Telephone Company advertising on radio. And it was not called advertising, it was called a toll. Like you pay a toll on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, that's what it's called. It was a toll. Early ads that you could hear on radio were oil companies. Again, big oil companies, right? Big business. Department stores coming about because of industrialization. Even American Express, the at that time wire transfer company, now credit card company. So American radio really grew up supported by advertising, and that is different from other places around the world. If you go to most European countries, you'll find that most European countries have radio that is funded not by advertising but by a license fee. A license fee, just like you pay a license to have a car or a dog or a gun. Yeah, you have to pay a license to have a television in Britain, and if that license fee money, it's about $400 a year. That goes to the government. The government gives it to an organization that produces then public service television. That organization in Britain happens to be the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. It goes to that organization, they produce content. It's not necessarily like our PBS. No. The BBC is very different. In fact, the BBC has its own top 40 radio station. It's called Radio 1. So you can listen to pop hits, as they call it in Britain, and it's not just commercial oriented, it's also actually provided by a license fee. So that's just a quick aside to compare the U.S. to other countries and show you that the U.S. is very commercial compared to other countries. All right, so, we had the networks coming up. I want to mention those in the history of radio. You don't have individual radio stations operating so much as you have networks operating. A network is the idea that you have a studio, a central studio located in New York, most of them are, or LA, and then that studio feeds the other stations that are part of the network. They are called affiliates. So you have an NBC affiliate, you have an ABC affiliate. In Pennsylvania here, we have a television station in Scranton called WNEP. That is an ABC affiliate. So these are affiliates that grew up. They're also they are networks that grew up because of affiliates. The big networks are William Paley's CBS. I've already mentioned that in this class. A cigar company bought a radio network, formed a radio network in 1928. And then we have NBC, the National Broadcasting Company. And then eventually NBC had to sell off one of its radio networks because of monopoly concerns, and that became the ABC radio network. And then we also have the Fox radio network and the ESPN radio network, which came about later. The golden age of radio was the 20s through the 40s. 20s through the 40s was the golden age of radio. No television on the scene. Radio had far surpassed newspapers in terms of entertaining people and even news in some respects. You could find the most diverse programming you would ever believe on radio in the 1920s to the 40s. You had mysteries, soaps, varieties, westerns, sci-fis, comedies, sports, news. I mean, you had it all. It was radio's golden age. And in fact, here at East Stroudsburg University, WESS Radio, our campus radio station, which I advise, that radio station broadcasts vintage radio programs from Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 in the morning. We do that because we have 3,000 hours of those programs that were donated to our university. It's a national treasure that we have right here at East Stroudsburg University. The biggest stars in radio, the biggest stars period, they were in radio. They weren't on vaudeville anymore. They were in radio in the golden age. Radio had the biggest audiences. There's a program that, again, we're going to call out racism when we come across it as part of the history of mass media. And we'll acknowledge the historical part, but we'll also call out the racist part. One of the longest running shows was Amos and Andy, two white guys painted as black people. You can see a clip in today's links. And they are really lampooning the black people. It's a kind of comedy where you're really making fun of them by them making fun of themselves, if you know what I mean. They're caricatures of them, of the slow black accent, the so black dumb accent. A lot of people say it reeks of. It was a very popular show, and from today's vantage point, a very racist show, Amos and Andy. It reached hundreds of millions of people across the U.S. and across the world, that show. All right, in the 1950s, radio's big shows like that and vintage radio programs, all came to a crashing end because television was invented. And television just claimed more and more of radio's audiences. The best actors, like the Lone Ranger, they went over to television from radio. The advertisers went over to radio, collapsed. A lot of people said, oh, it's going to die. There won't be any more radio after this television, this televising vision, right? But radio reinvented itself. In the 1960s, it came up with a formula they called the format radio. And so format radio is all about having a very niche kind of content that appeals to a very small audience. So you will just do country music. You will just do news. You will just do classic rock and roll, not even all rock and roll. You would just do top 40, on and on and on. That's format radio, and that's what has made radio successful. You don't try to go for everybody anymore with a radio station. You just try to go for females 18 to 35 because this is a top 40 radio station. Or you just try to go for men and women, business people 35 to 54 because this is an all-news radio station. That's how radio works today. One of the big inventions that also changed radio and made it more of a companion medium, not that it wasn't already a companion medium, different from other media, is the Walkman, as it was known, invented by Sony, which allowed you to carry around the cassette tape. You can see a picture of it in the links today. and with earphones, and it put people for the first time into their own worlds that really paved the way psychologically, in my opinion, for the cell phone, that just allow people to be actually talking on the phone in Target or wherever, totally oblivious to everybody around them, having this comment. That the Walkman really started that whole psychology and listening to music, and later came the iPod, and then later just listening to music through earbuds, wherever you're listening to it through. It all started in 1979 with the iPod. Let's talk about music, youth, and culture and society. Music, youth culture, I should say. Just a certain kind of culture, youth culture and society. So rock and roll is at the core of this. Rock and roll, bands like the Rolling Stones. What happened was there were new instruments that were invented that took advantage of electricity, mainly the solid body guitar, the rock and roll guitar, the Fender, the Gibson, the guitar that you see rock stars playing, like Keith Richards was playing with Jumpin' Jack Flash at the beginning of class today. And rock and roll came out as a result of rhythm and blues and country and gospel. And if you want to take a course in this, our department offers a course in the spring semester called Pop Music as Cultural Text. Popular Music as Cultural Text with Dr. Charlie Warner, who's retiring in May. Last chance to take it with him. It's an awesome class. Shows how rock and roll came about. Before all of these things came together with a solid body guitar, basically before 1948, recordings by black musicians were referred to as race records. They were referred to as race records because the American public was not thought to have an appetite for black musicians at that time. So radio producers did not play these records, but they became very popular. People were playing them at parties all the time. They contained mostly rhythm and blues music. Rhythm and blues coming up out of the South in those cotton fields, slaves singing to each other chants and rhythms and talking about their stories to get through the day and to have to bring some levity to a situation that really deserves no levity. And that's where rhythm and blues comes from. And so then all of this merges together with the electricity and the solid body guitar. And in 1948, get Wynonie Harris with the song Good Rockin' Tonight. Good Rockin' Tonight. Good Rockin' Tonight, black musician breaking through because of popular demand. The song was great. That's what it was about. Wynonie Harris, Good Rockin' Tonight, 1947. But it wasn't sold to the American public until Elvis Presley, a white guy, until Elvis Presley later covered that song. And then therein we have the two main figures emerge that really forge what is known as rock and roll. And those two figures are Elvis Presley, who was a famous singer, but he didn't write any of his own songs, and he was basically put as a face because of television coming out on the face of black music. Again, racist thinking was America was not ready for black musicians, but Chuck Berry showed us that was not the case. Chuck Berry, not only one of the first black musicians, but one of the very best rock guitarists you can ever find. His rock sound in many ways invented the whole genre of rock and roll. Chuck Berry, he did an incredible guitar playing routine with the duck walk. You can see some of that in the links that I provided today. And so these two brought rock music out into the forefront, and that's where we get today. We got rock and hard rock and metal and all the other derivations of rock. There were two radio DJs that had a scandalous time period, Alan Freed and Dewey Phillips. They were popular playing rock and roll, but then there was the whole payola scandal, where it was proven that radio DJs, including these two, were accepting money, and then that was influencing the songs they were playing, which is then influencing the commercial success of the bands. Music has changed so much over the years. When you talk about popular music, we can look at Motown music, which was actually in Detroit City. And Motown Records was founded by a black musician, Berry Gordy, Berry, Gordy, Dory. Celebrated very much still today because blacks for the first time on his record label were performing black written music. Not whites performing black music, not blacks performing white music, blacks performing black music. Examples: Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. The Supremes' amazing trio of black females singers harmonizing. Marvin Gaye is very much embodying Motown. Later on, we get the British Invasion. The British Invasion is all these bands from Britain coming over, including the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. There's a documentary going around. Beatles still very popular. The Who, the Hollies, Led Zeppelin. And during this time period, live shows were taken to new extremes. You had the whole football stadiums being filled up, and you had costuming that was outrageous, and light shows, and in a case like Motley Crue, drummers hanging upside down on a track. So live shows, because the amplifier allowed you to send the sound all the way from the stage, all the way to the other side of a football stadium, truly amazing. Also, record producers started to grow up during this time period. Record producers started to become an important part of the recording process because albums were made using multi-track recording techniques. Multi-track recording techniques allow you to have a person in the studio at a different time from another person in the studio, and they're both playing on the same song. You can bring in a saxophonist in a London studio with a recording that was done in LA and add the saxophonist there. And so you need producers to organize all this and to add all the different instruments in. And so people like Alan Parsons and Rick Rubin, they became very big in terms of record producers. In the 1970s, the most amazing development for music, recorded music, was the invention of stereo. Stereo took music and broke it into two channels so that if you listen to your cans, as we call it, headphones, or even if you just listen to two speakers, most systems are playing back in stereo today, you've got the music broken up. You've got a guitar on the left side, and on the right side you have a completely different guitar if you're talking about rock and roll. And where do they come together? Here, in your head. They come in through your ears and your head puts them together. It's an amazing way that stereo works through with the head. And then the last part of music that we want to mention today as we wrap up in terms of recorded music is we do have music that is providing a lot of advocacy for groups, different groups, war groups, peace groups, marriage groups, gay groups, drug groups even, and one of those groups is gay groups, which was appealed to by disco. I lived through the disco era. I was working in a restaurant pantry with a thumping disco floor outside, and even the Rolling Stones jumped in with a song like Miss You, but it was all about You Can Ring My Bell and Casey and the Sunshine Band, all the disco music. And what it did was it made music more danceable, and it highlighted musically the bass guitar. These two things together made fashion and gay culture more mainstreamed because gay culture was celebrated very much by disco music and the androgyny of it, going back and forth between maleness and femaleness. So a lot to consider there. Even ran over my shooted for target of 30 minutes, but I hope the lecture was worth it for you today, and I certainly hope that you are able to enjoy music from a new vantage point now that you know that it's recorded and how that came about. Have a great day.